Hey guys, so today we're talking about aquatic biomes. Yesterday we talked about terrestrial biomes. So today we're going to talk about aquatic biomes. I'm going to go ahead and pull up the PowerPoint so we can kind of talk about it. So aquatic biomes are characterized very differently from terrestrial biomes. Terrestrial biomes are largely characterized by rainfall and temperature, or precipitation and temperature. Aquatic biomes instead are characterized by salinity, the presence or absence of current, and light penetration. Those are the three major pieces. So we're going to jump in and talk about the fundamental division between freshwater ecosystems or biomes and saltwater. So let's go ahead and jump in and talk about our freshwater ecosystems. So three main categories of freshwater biomes. Those are rivers and streams, lakes and ponds, and marshes and swamps. 2% of Earth's water is contained in freshwater, so a very small portion. And our freshwater ecosystems are an important part of the hydrologic cycle that cycles water back to the oceans. So our first freshwater biome is rivers and streams. Rivers and streams change greatly from their headwater to their mouth. They are characterized by their flow. So at the headwaters, rivers and streams tend to be shallow, they tend to be cool, and because they are swiftly moving, they are highly oxygenated because as they move over rocks and obstacles, it incorporates air. At the mouth of rivers, water tends to be moving more slowly. It is not as cool, and it is therefore less highly oxygenated. Many rivers have a delta at their mouth, meaning that it spreads out into lots of little fingers where it joins either another river or a bay or an ocean. Okay, our second freshwater biome is lakes and ponds. So these are bodies of freshwater that do not flow. There are three zones in lakes and ponds. They are littoral, limnetic, and profundal. And lakes and ponds, depending on depth, can experience thermal stratification. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So the first zone in lakes and ponds is what's called the littoral zone. This is the shallow water area along the shore. You tend to have lots and lots of photosynthetic organisms here because there's very nice light penetration. The limnetic zone is the open water beyond the littoral zone. You tend to have swimmers here, but also lots of photosynthetic activity. The littoral zone, you find lots of amphibians and lots of young of the animals that live in the limnetic zone. Not all lakes have a profundal zone, but those that do, it's beneath the limnetic zone. Profundal comes from the word profound, meaning deep. So this is a depth of more than 12 to 15 meters. And there's very little light penetration, so you do not have photosynthetic organisms in your profundal zones. Lakes experience something called thermal stratification if they're deep enough. Thermal stratification means the temperature changes sharply with depth, and there's this thermocline, somewhere usually around 12 meters, and at that point, there's a significant temperature transition between the warmer surface water that's been warmed by the sun and the colder water. This is only present in the warmer months, so in the summertime. You guys might remember from your chemistry class that colder water is more dense than warmer water, and so by the virtue of their density, the warmer water is trapped at the surface and it can't circulate down to the colder water. As the air cools and there's less sunlight, then the surface water starts to cool. When the surface water reaches the same temperature as the water below that thermocline, or a cooler temperature even than the water below the thermocline, then we get something called fall turnover. And in fall turnover, the now colder surface water sinks below the deeper water and the entire lake turns over. This means that that nice, highly oxygenated surface water is sinking down to the bottom and bringing oxygen to the bottom of the lake. And the deeper water circulates up to the top and has an opportunity to become oxygenated. This is really significant for the aquatic life because oxygen brings life. All right, so our third freshwater biome is marshes and swamps. These are lands that shallow freshwater covers for at least a portion of the year. We do have something called vernal swamps or vernal marshes, and those are seasonal. They tend to occur in the spring and the fall when there's lots of rain, and you get little temporary swamps that spring up in different places. Marshes and swamps have very characteristic soil because it is waterlogged and tends to stay anaerobic for long periods of time. It tends to be acidic. It contains a lot of carbon dioxide, so it's a great sink for the carbon cycle. We'll talk about that later. The vegetation in marshes and swamps is particularly adapted to be water tolerant. So the picture here is of bald cypresses, which are very characteristic in our area. They have those little knees that stick up out of the water. Those are actually part of their root system, and they're sticking up in order to bring oxygen to the roots. In the past, we tended to fill in marshes and swamps. We viewed them as a hazard or an issue. There was a significant movement in the 1700s and 1800s to drain and fill in the Great Dismal Swamp. In more recent times, we've recognized that marshes and swamps provide significant ecosystem services, which means that they provide significant services to us as human beings. The most significant of those are flood protection and water filtration. Okay, so estuaries. Estuaries straddle the line between freshwater and saltwater biomes because they are where the freshwater rivers mix with salt water. These are very variable environments. They vary from area to area. They vary from day to day. They even vary from hour to hour during the day. And they vary in temperature, in salinity, and in depth of light penetration. These are very productive environments. Nutrients are brought in from the land. The tidal action circulates those nutrients and oxygenates the water. We have lots of light penetration in shallow water, which means we have lots of photosynthetic organisms, which means we have lots of food. Estuaries are considered the nurseries of the marine environments. So many saltwater animals come to estuaries to spawn or to raise their young. Unfortunately, estuaries are also being significantly impacted by pollution. There are a lot of what we call dead zones or hypoxic zones. So those are areas where the nutrient load has become so high that the resultant algal blooms and die-offs have consumed all of the oxygen, and so you have areas where no aquatic organisms can live because there's not enough oxygen in the water. Okay, let's talk about marine ecosystems. So our marine ecosystems are divided by life zones. So they're divided into the intertidal zone, the benthic zone, and what's called the pelagic or open ocean environment. So the intertidal zone is that area of the shoreline between the low tide line and the high tide line. Depending on the location, this can be a sandy environment, this can be a rocky environment, this can be a bedrock environment. Lots of different species live here. They are uniquely adapted to live in the water at some times and out of the water at others. And they're adapted to those changing conditions in terms of water, in terms of air, and also in terms of salinity, because the intertidal zone is a changing salinity environment. The benthic zone is the ocean floor. Near the shore, this tends to be sand, but for most of the benthic zone, it's actually mud. So you have lots of burrowing worms and clams. There are 3 zones depending on the depth. We have the bathal zone, the abyssal zone, and the hadal zone. But the most important thing to remember about the benthic zone is this is the ocean floor zone. There are lots of really productive benthic communities. Seagrass beds are in the shallow areas, present to a depth of about 10 meters, so 32 feet. They provide a habitat for lots of species, and they provide food to their ecosystem. Going a little bit deeper, we have kelp forests. These are long brown algae, so they have a slightly different photosynthetic process. The brown algae can actually do photosynthesis with lower light levels, so they're uniquely adapted to this deeper zone, and they have a diversity of life that rivals coral reefs. Sorry, forgot to mention about seagrass beds, that they only go down to 10 meters because that's as deep as light can penetrate and have productive photosynthesis for green photosynthesis. And then we have coral reefs. These are the pretty benthic communities. These are the ones that people tend to think of when they think of saving the ocean. So corals are actually tiny marine organisms that build a calcium carbonate exoskeleton and then live inside of it. This is the most diverse of all marine environments, not just because of the corals, but because of the habitat that they provide for many thousands of other species. These are found only in shallow, warm water. So seagrass beds, kelp forests, and coral reefs. There are 3 distinct kinds of coral reefs. There's a fringing reef that is directly attached to a continent but does not have a lagoon. We have an atoll, which is a circular reef with a lagoon. And then you have a barrier reef, which separates a lagoon from an ocean. Lagoons are also very, very productive marine environments. Okay, so what impact do we have on all of this? So one of our major impacts on coral reefs is through sedimentation. When there's sediment in the water, it tends to create turbidity, which is a measurement of diffraction of light. When we have diffraction of light, there's not as much light reaching the coral reefs. They do depend on photosynthesis, and so that tends to kill coral reefs when there's too much sedimentation in the water. Overfishing also impacts coral reefs, both because it removes organisms from the environment, but also because fishing in and of itself tends to damage coral reefs because contact with the reefs can actually damage them. In some areas, coral reefs are actually mined for building materials, and then runoff pollution. So whether that's too much nutrients or whether that's other pollutants that kill the coral directly. Okay, let's talk about the pelagic or the open ocean environment. So there are 2 main divisions within the open ocean. There's the neritic province, so that's the shallower area of the open ocean, up to 200 meters. And then we have the oceanic province. This is everything deeper. This is, again, not the benthic zone, but all the water above the benthic zone. 75% of the world's ocean is in the oceanic province. Most organisms in the oceanic province are dependent on what we call marine snow, which is the organisms, phytoplankton and zooplankton, that exist near the surface, that as they die, they kind of snow down into the deeper part of the ocean. And so your filter feeders, scavengers, eat that marine snow, and then the predators eat them. Okay, lots of human impacts on the ocean, whether it's non-point source pollution, so runoff, or point source pollution. This is from ships, ports, processing plants. One of our major impacts on the ocean is invasive species. These are things that hitch a ride either on ships' hulls or in ballast water. We also impact with our fishing processes, whether that's overfishing, meaning taking too much of a particular species, or bycatch, that's harming other animals that we're not intending to catch, and which tend to get thrown back but may have been injured in the process, or whether we're talking about aquaculture or fish farming, which creates an environment where there's lots of fish in one area, which means we have a concentrated source of waste. Some other ways that we're impacting the ocean: coastal development. When we develop on the coast, we impact or remove estuaries, but we also remove a lot of coastal wetlands that provide filtration that prevents pollutants and sediment from reaching the ocean. We talked a little bit about habitat destruction, whether it's very, very rarely intentional, but a lot of the ways that we fish damage the floor of the ocean. And then climate change. So climate change is having big impacts on the ocean, both in terms of how warm the ocean is, but also how acidic the ocean is, because as carbon dioxide is absorbed into the water, it actually forms carbonic acid and decreases the pH of the ocean. So that's it for aquatic biomes. If you have questions, let me know.